So Mark Carney just detonated the most sophisticated economic weapon any American ally has ever deployed against the United States. Not a tariff, not a sanction, not a diplomatic protest or a press conference or an angry phone call. In the span of 10 days, the Canadian Prime Minister flew to 3 continents and signed strategic partnerships with India, Australia, and Japan that collectively represent the largest coordinated economic realignment away from the United States by any Western ally in the post-war era. The numbers are staggering: a $2.6 billion uranium deal with India, a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan covering defense, energy, and critical minerals, a defense technology and critical minerals pact with Australia, 12 new trade agreements across 4 continents in 6 months, $5.5 billion in commercial agreements with India alone. And the centerpiece, the detail that has Washington genuinely alarmed, is the framework Carney laid out at the World Economic Forum in Davos to bridge the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the European Union, effectively constructing a parallel global trade architecture that routes around the United States entirely. Warren Buffett, who has watched American trade policy with increasing alarm for over a year, connected the strategic implications with the clinical precision of someone who has spent 94 years understanding how markets punish stupidity. Trade should not be a weapon, Buffett said, and when you use it as one, eventually people stop trading with you. They don't announce it, they don't make threats, they just quietly build new roads that don't pass through your town. And one morning you wake up and the highway is empty. When you hear what Carney actually set in motion during those 10 days, the specific deals that were signed, the strategic frameworks that were agreed, the defense partnerships that were formalized, and the speed at which decades of American alliance architecture are being systematically rewired, you will understand why senior officials in both Washington and Ottawa are calling this the most consequential shift in North American geopolitics since the signing of the original free trade agreement. Hit subscribe, because what Carney just set in motion is going to reshape the North American economy for the next 50 years, and this is unfolding in real time. Let me walk you through how we got here, because this did not happen in a vacuum. It was the product of over a year of escalating economic aggression that pushed America's closest ally past a breaking point that most people in Washington still do not fully comprehend. The trade war had been grinding since early 2025. 25% tariffs on Canadian goods imposed under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, legislation that was designed for genuine national security emergencies and had never been used against the country's closest ally. Counter-tariffs from Ottawa, public rhetoric that crossed every line of diplomatic decorum that had governed the relationship for 75 years, Trump publicly suggesting Canada should become the 51st state, Trump posting altered maps on social media showing Canada absorbed into the United States alongside Venezuela, Greenland, and Cuba. Trump declaring to the world that America does not need anything Canada produces, a statement so economically illiterate that trade economists on both sides of the border struggle to respond to it with anything other than disbelief, given that Canada supplies critical energy, minerals, lumber, agricultural products, and automotive components that flow through every sector of the American economy. The provocations accumulated like weight on a structure that was never designed to bear this kind of stress. The tariffs expanded. Auto production in Canada dropped 5.4% in 2025 and continued falling into 2026. 25% tariffs on automobiles and auto parts came into effect in April. Cross-border supply chains that had operated seamlessly for decades began fracturing in ways that could not be reversed with a phone call or a press release. Workers in Michigan auto plants and Ontario manufacturing facilities were losing shifts, losing hours, losing the quiet confidence that someone in charge had a plan to fix any of this. International allies were watching with growing alarm. European leaders, G7 partners, NATO officials were pressing both governments to find a way to de-escalate before the damage became irreversible. Most Americans do not realize how close the relationship came to total collapse. And then came Davos. In January 2026, Mark Carney stood before the World Economic Forum and delivered a speech that diplomats, economists, and foreign policy analysts across the world immediately recognized as a declaration of strategic independence from the United States. He did not mention Trump by name. He did not need to. The 80-year period when the United States embraced the mantle of global economic leadership, Carney told the audience, when it forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services, is over. While this is a tragedy, it is also the new reality. He called on middle powers to unite. He warned that if countries like Canada, like Australia, like Japan, and Germany and South Korea were not at the table, they would be on the menu. He announced that Canada had already signed 12 new economic and security agreements across 4 continents in 6 months. And then he said the sentence that changed everything, the sentence that sources in multiple foreign ministries describe as the moment the post-war Western alliance entered a new phase. If the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will. Trump responded from Davos by lashing out at Carney by name, warning that Canada's existence was dependent on the United States and that Carney should show more gratitude. He threatened 100% tariffs if Canada negotiated a free trade agreement with China. The threat was designed to intimidate. It achieved the precise opposite of the stated objective. Instead of retreating, instead of moderating, instead of doing what every Canadian Prime Minister for the past 40 years had done when pressured by Washington, Carney told reporters the following day that he had spoken to Trump directly. I meant what I said in Davos. Canada was the first country to understand the change in U.S. policy, and we are the first country to act on it. Polls showed the speech had boosted the Liberals' lead over the Conservatives to 15 points. Canadians, it turned out, were finished asking Washington for permission. And then Carney boarded a plane, not to Washington, to Mumbai, and what he built over the next 10 days is what has Washington reaching for a response it does not have. The departure was February 26th, the Wednesday evening, the government aircraft lifting off from Ottawa into winter darkness. Carney's delegation was the largest trade mission a Canadian Prime Minister had assembled in over a decade. 5 cabinet ministers, including the ministers responsible for international trade, foreign affairs, and public safety, senior trade negotiators, pension fund executives from some of the largest institutional investors in the country, policy specialists covering energy, critical minerals, defense technology, artificial intelligence, and agricultural trade. According to officials traveling with the delegation, the aircraft was configured for working sessions that continued through the overnight flight. The delegation carried briefing binders organized by country, by sector, by strategic objective. They carried economic models showing the precise dollar-by-dollar impact of trade diversification on Canadian GDP over 10, 20, and 30-year horizons. They carried something else, something that cannot be quantified in a briefing document, but that every person on that aircraft understood. They carried the mandate of a country that had decided, collectively, irreversibly, that the old relationship with the United States was over and that a new economic architecture had to be built before the USMCA review began in July. The first stop was Mumbai, then New Delhi, 4 days in India. The bilateral meetings with Prime Minister Narendra Modi took place at Hyderabad House, a grand colonial-era building in the diplomatic quarter of New Delhi where India conducts its most consequential foreign engagements. The room was arranged with the careful formality that characterizes Indian state diplomacy. National flags positioned behind each delegation, officials seated facing each other across a polished conference table, cameras admitted for the opening minutes, the practiced choreography of 2 leaders who understood that what they were about to formalize would be studied and analyzed for years to come. The private tete-a-tete between Carney and Modi lasted 35 minutes. The expanded meeting with full delegations ran 90 minutes. When the cameras left and the heavy doors of Hyderabad House closed, according to sources familiar with the discussions, the atmosphere was markedly different from the stilted, cautious diplomatic exchanges that had characterized Canada-India relations for the previous 2 years. The relationship had been frozen, deep frozen. Accusations of Indian intelligence operations targeting Canadian citizens on Canadian soil, the expulsion of diplomats, a mutual frost that had seemed to most observers essentially permanent. And now, in the space of a single meeting, the frost was gone. Not because the underlying issues had been resolved, Carney described his approach as values-based realism and largely sidestepped questions about Indian meddling, but because both leaders had arrived at the same strategic calculation independently, and that calculation was more powerful than any bilateral grievance. India needed reliable energy and mineral supply partners who were not China, not Russia, and increasingly not dependent on American goodwill for their foreign policy decisions. Canada needed markets that were not the United States. The alignment was structural. The deal was not just possible, it was inevitable. The moment it crystallized, according to one official present, was when the discussion turned to uranium. India operates 24 nuclear reactors. It has a target of reaching 100 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2047, a 12-fold increase from current levels. That expansion requires fuel, massive, reliable, decades-long fuel supply. And Canada, through Cameco Corporation in Saskatoon, holds one of the world's largest uranium reserves. The $2.6 billion agreement was signed with the kind of quiet, deliberate finality that marks deals both sides know will outlast the political leaders who negotiated them. 22 million pounds of uranium ore concentrate delivered from 2027 through 2035, a 9-year supply contract that binds the two economies together in the most fundamental way possible through energy, through physical infrastructure, through the material that powers a nation's electrical grid and cannot be sourced from a press conference or a social media post. But the uranium deal was only the anchor. The full package included 10 commercial agreements valued at $5 billion. The launch of negotiations for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with a target of concluding by end of 2026. A stated goal of more than doubling bilateral trade to $70 billion by 2030, up from approximately $9 billion. Memorandums of understanding on critical minerals value chains, renewable energy cooperation, defense dialogue at the senior official level, maritime security, and artificial intelligence. Canada announced it would begin the process of joining the International Solar Alliance. India expressed support for Canada joining the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And then Carney said something in his remarks alongside Modi that landed with a weight that went beyond diplomatic formula. There has been more engagement between the Canadian and Indian governments in the last year than there has been in more than 2 decades combined. A pause. This is not merely the renewal of a relationship, it is the expansion of a valued partnership with new ambition, focus, and foresight, a partnership between 2 confident countries charting our own course for the future. Sources inside the Canadian delegation described a moment after the formal signing ceremony as the delegation gathered in a corridor of Hyderabad House before departing for the motorcade. A senior trade official turned to a colleague and said quietly, so that only the people immediately around them could hear, 5 words. We just redirected the Canadian economy. 5 words. And every person who heard them knew they were true. But the India trip was only the first movement of the symphony, and the crescendo was still building. From New Delhi, the delegation flew to Sydney, then Canberra, then Tokyo, and at every stop the pattern repeated with accelerating momentum and expanding strategic scope. In Australia, Carney addressed both houses of Parliament, the first Canadian Prime Minister to do so in nearly 20 years. He deepened cooperation on critical minerals and defense technology. He formalized agreements on maritime security that carry direct implications for Arctic sovereignty, a subject that touches the most sensitive nerve in the Canadian-American security relationship. In Canberra, Carney pushed the Middle Powers agenda hard, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese publicly aligned himself with Carney's vision. 2 nations, both treaty allies of the United States, publicly declaring that the old order was over and that a new architecture was necessary. In Tokyo, Carney and Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi signed a new comprehensive strategic partnership covering defense, energy, trade, and technology. 3 new agreements on international emergency response, joint Coast Guard exercises, and combating illegal fishing in the North Pacific. Instructions to officials to identify immediate investment opportunities through pension funds. Expanded trade in liquefied natural gas, with Carney noting that Canada could double its LNG exports by the end of the decade and double again by the end of the following decade. He even spoke a few halting sentences in Japanese during his remarks, a gesture that drew enthusiastic applause and underscored the personal investment in the relationship. Canada had overtaken the United States as the #1 supplier of wheat and pork to Japan, now providing 10% of Japan's total caloric intake. Think about that for a moment. Canada is now feeding Japan more than America is, and the speed of the diplomacy told its own devastating story. 10 days, 3 countries, 3 continents, $5.5 billion in deals with India alone. Comprehensive strategic partnerships formalized, defense agreements signed, energy frameworks locked in, agricultural supply relationships cemented, a coalition of middle powers assembling in real time with Canada at the center and the United States on the outside looking in. According to sources familiar with the Washington reaction, the administration's trade team found itself confronting a strategic reality they had not modeled, had not gamed, and did not know how to counter. The tariff playbook assumed that economic pressure would produce compliance. It assumed that Canada, with 75% of its exports flowing south, had no alternative. It assumed that threats would produce fear and fear would produce concessions. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. Markets responded to the India deal with a clarity that cut through the political noise. Cross-border industrial stocks dropped. Energy companies with Canadian supply chain dependencies recalculated their exposure. Defense contractors who had expected Canadian procurement contracts began issuing cautious guidance to investors. Business leaders on both sides of the border who had paused their contingency planning in hope of a reset reactivated it with urgency. The failed strategy did not just fail to produce concessions. It accelerated the very diversification it was designed to prevent. One anonymous official from within the administration described the internal response with a candor that bordered on despair. We were negotiating with ourselves while Carney was negotiating with the world. We were focused on messaging. He was focused on architecture, and architecture wins. Members of Trump's own trade team, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed the assessment. We had no counter strategy for this. The tariff framework assumes bilateral leverage. Carney went multilateral. He built a coalition. We are still operating country by country. He is operating system by system. And here is the detail that should genuinely alarm anyone who depends on the stability of the North American economic relationship. The implications go far beyond diplomacy. Warren Buffett, tracking the developments from Omaha with the methodical attention he brings to any investment worth studying, responded to the India deal specifically with a statement that translated the geopolitical upheaval into the economic language that markets understand. In 60 years of deal-making, Buffett said, I have watched leaders respond to pressure in one of two ways. Some leaders panic, they react, they escalate, they confuse volume with strategy and threats with leverage. Other leaders prepare, they study the board, they identify their strengths, they build coalitions, and they move quietly, building positions that are unassailable by the time anyone notices what they have done. What Carney just executed across 3 countries in 10 days is the most intelligent economic strategy I have seen from any Western leader in my lifetime. It is not a reaction, it is an architecture. And architectures, once built, do not unbuild. Buffett expanded on the analysis with the clinical precision that has defined his commentary for 6 decades. Let me tell you what most people are missing about the Canada situation, Buffett said. They are looking at individual deals, a uranium contract here, a defense partnership there, a trade agreement somewhere else, and they are evaluating each one on its own merits. That is the wrong way to look at it. What Carney has built is a system. Every deal connects to every other deal. The uranium fuels India's nuclear expansion and creates a dependency that will outlast every politician involved. The critical minerals feed Japan's technology sector and Australia's defense manufacturing. The LNG powers energy transitions across the Pacific. The defense agreements create security relationships that did not exist 6 months ago, and every single one of those dependencies used to run through the United States. In 94 years on this earth, Buffett continued, and his voice carried the weight of someone who has seen more economic cycles than most institutions, I have learned that the most dangerous moment in any business relationship is not when the other side gets angry. Anger passes. It is when the other side gets quiet, when they stop arguing, when they stop negotiating, when they stop asking for meetings and returning phone calls, because that is when they have decided with finality that they do not need you anymore. That is exactly what has happened with Canada. They stopped arguing. They stopped asking Washington for meetings. They went to India. They went to Australia. They went to Japan, and they built something new. The economic translation was equally devastating. Every dollar of trade that moves from the United States to India, to Japan, to Australia, to the European Union is a dollar that does not come back, not because of politics, not because of sentiment, because of infrastructure. Pipelines get built, contracts get signed, port facilities expand, supply chains reconfigure around new routes and new relationships and new institutional frameworks. And once a country's economic infrastructure points in a new direction, changing it back is not a political decision. It is a physical impossibility. You do not unbuild a pipeline because a president changes his mind. You do not unsign a 9-year, $2.6 billion uranium contract because the political winds shift. You do not undo the fact that Canada now provides 10% of Japan's caloric intake because someone in Washington decides they want to be friends again. And then Buffett delivered the verdict line, the single sentence that will define this chapter of the American-Canadian story and every analysis and every history written about it for the next 50 years. This is what happens when you use trade as a weapon against your best friend. Your best friend finds new friends. And then you are alone at the table holding a weapon that nobody is afraid of anymore because there is nobody left in the room to point it at. The cascading consequences of what Carney has set in motion extend far beyond trade numbers and bilateral agreements. They reach into the structural foundations of the North American security architecture that has kept the continent stable for 75 years. Begin with the economics. Canada's share of goods exports going to the United States fell to 71.7% in 2025, the lowest since the early 1980s, before the original free trade agreement was even signed. And that number is accelerating downward. Annual exports to the United States fell 5.8%, offset almost entirely by a 17.2% export gain to non-American markets. The diversification is not theoretical. It is not aspirational. It is measurable, structural, and accelerating with every deal Carney signs. The $2.6 billion uranium contract with India, the $5.5 billion in commercial agreements, the comprehensive strategic partnerships with Japan, the defense and critical minerals pacts with Australia, the framework Carney proposed at Davos to bridge the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership with the European Union, effectively creating a parallel global trade system that 12 countries and the world's largest single market can operate within, without the United States at the center. Each agreement individually is significant. Together, they represent the construction of an alternative economic order that does not require American participation to function. Now consider the defense implications, because this is the dimension that almost nobody in mainstream commentary is discussing. Canada and the United States share NORAD, the binational aerospace defense command that protects the entire North American continent. They share intelligence through the Five Eyes Alliance. They share Arctic sovereignty responsibilities at a moment when Russian and Chinese military activity in the Arctic is increasing at rates that defense analysts describe as unprecedented, and Canada is now reviewing whether to proceed with the purchase of 88 F-35 fighter jets from the United States. Canada announced that it will prioritize domestic arms purchases and reduce reliance on American weapons manufacturers. Billions of dollars in defense procurement that American contractors expected to receive are now being reconsidered, redirected, and in some cases canceled. The defense relationship that protected the continent for 75 years is being renegotiated, restructured, and reoriented in real time. And here is the devastating irony, the detail that should keep every strategist in Washington awake at night. The tariffs were designed to project American strength. The 51st state rhetoric was designed to subordinate Canada into compliance. The trade war was designed to extract concessions and demonstrate that no country could afford to defy American economic pressure. And the result, the precise, measurable, documented result, is that Canada is now less economically dependent on the United States than it has been in 40 years. Canada is building defense capabilities independent of American manufacturers. Canada is constructing trade infrastructure that routes around the American economy. And Canada is assembling a coalition of middle powers, from India to Japan to Australia to the European Union, that is explicitly designed to operate without American leadership. The policy intended to force Canadian submission catalyzed Canadian independence, the precise opposite of the stated strategic objective. Every American adversary on earth is watching. China offered Canada expanded trade discussions with barely concealed strategic satisfaction. Every country that has been subjected to American tariff pressure is now studying Carney's playbook as a template for their own diversification. Germany, South Korea, the Philippines, the United Kingdom, Poland. If that is how America treats its best friend, the calculation runs, what would it do to us? And the answer every ally is reaching independently is the same answer Canada reached. Diversify, hedge, build new roads, reduce the vulnerability, because the old relationship is over, and the country that ended it is not the one most people expected. The trade war with Canada was never supposed to end like this. It was supposed to end with concessions, with a renegotiated USMCA that tilted decisively in American favor, with a chastened Canadian government returning to the table, compliant, grateful, ready to accept whatever terms Washington chose to dictate. Instead, it ends with a Canadian Prime Minister flying across 3 continents in 10 days, signing $5.5 billion in deals with India, formalizing a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan, deepening defense and technology ties with Australia, assembling the framework for a parallel global trade order that the United States is not part of, and doing it all with the calm, methodical, forensic discipline of a former central banker who understood before anyone else in the Western world that the rules had changed and that the countries that adapted fastest would define the new order, the $2.6 billion uranium deal, the 12 agreements across 4 continents, the 71.7% and falling, the 75-year alliance being quietly, methodically, irreversibly replaced by something new. Buffett called trade a weapon that America turned on its best friend. He warned that when you make 7.5 billion people dislike you, the mathematics eventually become unsurvivable. He said this is what happens when you confuse volume with strategy, threats with leverage, and dominance with strength. The old order will not be restored. Carney said that at Davos, and he meant it. He said it to Trump directly on a phone call and did not flinch. He said it to Modi in New Delhi, to Albanese in Canberra, to Takaichi in Tokyo. And every leader he met agreed, not reluctantly, not with diplomatic caveats, but with the clarity of people who have studied the situation, assessed the risks, and made a decision they will not be revisiting. There is a principle that every experienced negotiator understands, a principle that Buffett has articulated more clearly than anyone alive. You get one chance to demonstrate to the other side that you take them seriously, one chance to show that you have listened, that you have prepared, that you regard the person across the table as someone worthy of genuine engagement. Miss that chance and you do not get another. because the person across the table will not come back. They will find another table, they will build another room, and they will fill it with people who treated them with the respect you refuse to offer. That is exactly what has happened. Canada built another table. They filled it with India and Australia and Japan and the European Union and every middle power on earth that has watched American trade policy with the same alarm and reached the same conclusion. The diversification is underway, the contracts are signed, the infrastructure is being built, the pipelines, the port expansions, the supply chain reconfigurations, the defense procurement redirections, all of it is in motion, all of it is accelerating, and none of it reverses because someone in Washington changes their tone or posts a conciliatory message at 3 in the morning. The USMCA review begins in July. And every single day between now and then, the relationship that defined North America for 3/4 of a century becomes a little less recognizable, a little harder to repair, and a little closer to being replaced entirely by something that does not require American participation to function. Keep an eye on this. The architecture is being poured, and concrete, once it sets, does not change its shape.